I don't think adults always need advice. Someone starts explaining what's been happening, and before they've even properly reached the end of it, part of our mind's already looking for an answer for them, yeah? We're trying to figure out what they should do, what I would do, whether there's an obvious step that they've missed, or whether something from our own experiences might help. Yep, I do it too. It comes from a decent place usually, yeah? Watching someone carry something difficult is uncomfortable. If we care about them, we want to reduce that weight. Advice gives us something to do. It lets us feel useful instead of standing there with no answer while another person describes a problem that we can't remove. But I am beginning to wonder how often that urge makes us move too quickly. Yeah? I remember coming home from a kitchen shift once and saying that I felt as if I'd just been beaten up by a kitchen. Yeah, it it wasn't a precise explanation, of course. I'm not presenting a clear problem there with a useful beginning, a middle, and end. Yeah, I was just tired. I was wound tight and trying to explain this strange mix of physical exhaustion and the noise and the pressure and just that mental static that can follow you home after a rough service. And you know, there probably were things I could have done differently. They usually are. Yeah, you know, better boundaries, more rest. Just a different way of handling the shift. Yeah, maybe having a clearer conversation at work. Just but in that moment at the end of the night, I didn't need a plan. I just needed the day to be recognized for what it had been. Yeah, and there's a difference there. Not not every difficult conversation is asking for a solution. Sometimes a person is still trying to work out what the problem actually is while they speak. They may already know what needs to happen, even, but they don't yet have the energy or the clarity or maybe even just the money to make it happen. So, sometimes the practical answer is obvious. It still does nothing to touch the thing that they're trying to explain. Sometimes a person just needs to say the whole thing out loud and just get it out there in the universe, yeah? Without trying to organize it or make it useful. It just needs to exist, yeah? And that kind of listening is harder than it sounds. It asks us to just stay there even when we've got nothing useful to offer. There might be no obvious action attached to it. There's no clean moments where the conversation turns and we get to feel that we helped. But sometimes the person finishes speaking and the situation remains exactly the same, yeah? The bill still exists, that the relationship is still strained, the grief is still there. Nothing's been fixed, but something may have changed. Yeah? That person doesn't feel quite as alone inside of it. And that matters, yeah? Because adults carry a surprising amount without saying much about it. I want to say that again because I want it to, resonate and actually get someone's attention with it, yeah? Adults carry a surprising amount without saying much about it. Responsibility teaches people to keep moving, yeah? What work still expects us. Children need feeding. There's always 100 things to do. Life tends to reward people who remain functional. So people become very good at looking functional. They answer the question, they finish the shift, whatever. And from the outside, nothing appears broken, or at least not enough to cause a concern, yeah? They might be tired, they might be busy or just a bit quieter than usual, but they're still functioning. And that they become so convincing at this functioning that nobody notices what it costs them, yeah? And sometimes that they even convince themselves, yeah? They stop noticing it in themselves. And, you know, that as soon as you speak of someone, what's the first thing you say? How are you, isn't it, yeah? And how often does that get an honest answer, you know? It's just a greeting. It's just a space filler, conversation over, you know. And there's nothing wrong with that. Fine, how are you? Good. You know, there's nothing wrong with that conversation. Nobody wants to explain the full state of their life. Well, you just getting some milk in the supermarket. You know, something as mundane as that. But every now and then, so somebody asks it differently because they have noticed, yeah? You know, that they've noticed that you do not seem yourself. That they notice that you've gone quiet. They notice that you're knackered. And, you know, they're not trying to ask you clever questions, yeah? They're not trying to offer you a solution. They're just trying to do something basic. They're just trying to make your weight visible, yeah? Now, a person might have spent weeks telling themselves that they're overreacting. Just gonna close the windows because the wind's picking up a bit. You know, yeah, just being weak and making too much of everything, or simply just failing to cope with things that everyone else manages. And then another person, they look at that same situation and they just say plainly to them, you know, that sounds hard. I recognise that this is a hard situation for someone to be in. Yeah? The situation doesn't change, but that private argument around it does, yeah? For just for that moment, that they no longer have to prove that the thing hurts. And this is where the advice can go wrong. Even if it's sensible advice, it can still go wrong. You know, if someone says that they're struggling and that conversation just turns into what they've tried and what they've not tried and why the obvious answer is difficult, then before long, you're not talking about what has happened, yeah? You're not talking about what they're going through. You're just explaining why they haven't solved it yet. And that can make people feel even more alone than they were before. Yeah? You know, this person opened up looking for understanding, and instead they feel like they're under attack and they have to defend their effort. It doesn't mean that the advice is bad. You know, sometimes people do need advice. Sometimes problems become worse when everybody just stays polite and says the obvious thing. But there's a difference between helping someone and rushing to stop our own discomfort in letting them speak. Yeah? I think that first question, you know, that you ask yourself should be smaller. Are they asking me to help them think this through? Or am I just uncomfortable for not having an answer for them? Yeah? I'm not trying to turn listening into a perfect technique. This wind is getting really bad. That might be better. Yep. Look, I'm not trying to turn listening into a perfect technique, yeah? It just slows that reflex down long enough so you notice what sort of conversation is actually happening. Because people don't tell the truth in a neat order. Yeah, they'll circle around it. They'll minimalize it. They'll do everything they can to avoid it. Essentially, yeah. That sometimes people don't even fully understand what they're saying until they even hear themselves saying it. And when this good intended advice comes too early and shuts that conversation down, then that real point, you don't have, they never get to that real point. That real conversation never begins, yeah? And that's when conversations can become awkward. The silence can feel heavy, yeah? I get it, you know? But most people haven't been taught to just sit with somebody else's difficulty without trying to fix it or compare it or just minimalize it, yeah? We offer our answers because our answers have edges, you know? They're just easier to hold, yeah? Someone else's unfinished pain isn't easy to hold. But there's another side as well. You know, being seen can't mean expecting another person to read the mind we refuse to make available, yeah? A person can only respond to what we let them see. It's possible to want understanding while saying nothing honest enough to be understood, yeah? To answer fine every time turns everything serious into a joke, yeah? And you just reject every question, and then you quietly resent the fact that nobody seems to notice how bad things are. I know that pattern as well, yeah? There's a strange contradiction there in wanting someone to see through the mask while also punishing them, I can't speak today, for trying not to lift it, you know? We might want the comfort, but not the questions, yeah? We might want somebody to understand, but not want to explain it. And this is human. It is human, but that doesn't mean it's fair, yeah? Other people might sense that something is wrong, you know, they'll notice the silence and the short answers, but they can't reliably witness a truth that's permanently edited to them, you know? They don't need some big dramatic confession, just something a little less polished, yeah? Just being able to say, I don't know what I need. Yeah? That's okay. That's a good thing to say. If you genuinely don't know what you need, then it's okay to say that. Yeah? That kind of honesty, it doesn't guarantee you a perfect response, yeah? The other person might still get it wrong. They might still, they might still try to offer advice too quickly, or just get uncomfortable, or just say something clumsy to try and end the conversation because they don't know what else to do, yeah? People will still get it wrong from time to time, but at least they know what they're standing beside, yeah? Perhaps this is why certain conversations stay with us for years, yeah? But advice disappears almost immediately, yeah? Because we remember the people who let us finish. Yeah. We remember who let us rush. No, that's not right. You remember the people who paused so we didn't have to rush, yeah? Who just let us sit there in the silence without treating it as a problem. Nothing visible might have changed afterwards, yeah? There might not have been a plan. There might not have been some breakthrough, yeah? No clean decision about what's happened next, but something has been shared, And that can matter a lot more than people realise. Acknowledgement doesn't replace responsibility. It doesn't. But, you know, people might still have to act, yeah? Might still have to apologise or stay, you know, or face the number. I don't know, whatever it is, yeah? Being understood doesn't remove that becoming next. But it can make it feel less like a private failure, yeah? Sometimes people need advice. Sometimes they need practical help. And sometimes they need people to tell them the truth. And sometimes they just need someone to shut up and just remain in the room for long enough to recognise what the day or the week or whatever has actually cost them, yeah? Not to make the burden sound noble, not to turn understanding into permission to stay trapped, just to look at it honestly and say, yeah, that really is heavy.